I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Chris, to present this research. And I'd like to very quickly acknowledge my co-authors, Michael Lowe, Aditya Padavira-Maya, and Alina Sorescu. Now, this work came about from while I was doing my dissertation. I was reading a lot of the business press. And what I saw was a lot of the articles talked about how important corporate social responsibility, or CSR, is to brands and how much companies were spending on corporate social responsibility. And this led me to wonder, how does this actually affect consumer response? And more specifically, how does it affect brand sales? So we wanted to look a little bit deeper at the responsibility aspects of corporate social responsibility. That is to say, does this effect of CSR on brand sales vary depending on how much responsibility or accountability that brands take in their CSR initiatives for their negative impact on society or and the environment? That is to say, their negative externalities. And also, given the potential for CSR initiatives to foster greenwashing, we also wanted to look at whether or not this effect varies depending on CSR reputation. And as many of you know, CSR is often focused on environmental and social issues. So we wanted to look at the distinction between those on this effect. Now, just to give you a lay of the land, this is our framework. We actually studied this in two ways. One, we looked at real world data to look at this impact of different types of corporate social responsibility on brand purchase, as well as CSR focus, the effect of CSR focus and CSR reputation. But then we also conducted a series of lab studies to control a lot of the factors that you cannot control in the real world, to replicate these effects, but then also to look at the underlying mechanism or the motivation of perceived brand sincerity. That is to say, how consumers perceive the brands, how sincere they perceive the brand CSR initiatives to be. Now, what do we mean when we're talking about corrective, compensating, cultivating? These are three different types of CSR. What we're looking at, as I mentioned, we're looking at this responsibility aspect. Now, corrective CSR focuses on how much responsibility the brand takes in terms of addressing its harm to society and the environment through changes to its business practices. So you see here Starbucks with the fair trade symbol. So imagine a company, a coffee company, that goes from not engaging in fair trade policies to engaging in fair trade policies where they actually are paying the coffee growers a fair price for their products. Now, on to compensating. Similarly, the brand addresses harm to society and the environment, but in this case, they do not address it through their business practices. Again, Starbucks provides an illustration. So a few years ago in the UK, Starbucks started to charge a small upcharge for their paper cups. And the funds from this upcharge went towards an organization that that engages in recycling initiatives and promotes recycling initiatives in the UK. In this case, Starbucks did not change their use of paper cups. They did not change their recycling, but they did try to address it through this organization. And then finally, you have Cultivating CSR, where the brands do not actually address any of their harm to society or the environment. And these are a lot of the initiatives that we're most familiar with, where organizations donate money or other time or other resources, or even try to address various issues in society. So here in the US in 2015, Starbucks started the Race Together campaign, where they encourage their baristas to talk with their clients about race relations in the U.S. and a hope to kind of foster better, to reduce racial tensions in the U.S. Now, I want to be clear, when we're talking about companies addressing their harm to society, the environment, I'm not talking about huge brand crises. I'm not talking about an oil spill. I'm talking about the day-to-day impact that brands have on society and the environment through, for example, just the wages that they pay their employees, or the waste that they generate in daily operations, the pollution that they may generate in their manufacturing. So I'm going to start off to tell you about the real world data analysis that we did. We gathered 80 press releases about CSR initiatives from consumer packaged goods brands for grocery and drug stores across 48 designated market areas in the United States. We collected weekly sales data 52 weeks prior to the CSR announcement and 52 weeks after the CSR announcement for the brand in question, and a set of competitors. On average, we had about 5 competitors for each a focal brand. We also collected data on the CSR reputation, which was an index that we actually collected ourselves. We went into a CSR database and looked at and recorded the number of CSR or sustainability related news related to each focal brand and its competitors in the year before the focal brand's CSR announcement. And this could be an announcement of a CSR website. This could be announcement of their an award that the organization got for sustainability, a CSR annual report, anything like that, except for a new CSR initiative. We also recorded whether or not the CSR press announcement was socially or environmentally focused. And then in order to help rule out other reasons for increases in brand sales, we collected data on the brand's, the price of the brand's products, whether or not their products were on display or promotion within the stores, the extent to which their products were distributed across the US, advertising, as well as negative and positive press coverage. So what did we find? Well, we found that corrective and compensating CSR, which address harm to society and the environment, actually lead to an increase in sales. In fact, the corrective CSR leads to about a 1% increase in sales. Compensating, on the other hand, about a 3% increase in sales, whereas cultivating, which does not address this harm, the negative externality, leads to a slight decrease in sales of about 3.5%. Now, why does this cultivating CSR fail? Well, we addressed this in our experiment where we look at brand sincerity. And what we find is that corrective and compensating CSR initiatives are seen as more sincere. These are brands that clean up their own mess, whereas cultivating CSR initiatives are seen as relatively insincere. And the intuition is that brands that engage in cultivating CSR could use the money that they're donating to these unrelated issues to actually address issues that the organization has, or even to improve their products. So it's seen as a distraction or wasteful of resources or company resources. Now, I also mentioned that we looked at environmental versus social focus. And consumers in general have, just through the popular press, a better idea of companies' impact on the environment and society. And then also when it comes to social issues, there's a lot of variation, some of which consumers have a great deal of consensus on. Think of something like breast cancer research. On the other hand, some social issues that companies donate to may be viewed as very controversial to consumers, such as Black Lives Matter movement. So what we find is that for corrective CSR, brands actually receive a greater increase in sales when they engage in environmentally focused CSR initiatives. For compensating, what we see is that it doesn't matter. Environmental, social, in both cases, they see about a similar increase in sales. And then finally, for cultivating CSR, when it comes to environmentally focused initiatives, these brands are actually going to see an increase in sales, whereas socially focused are going to lead to a decrease. Now, I'd like to move on to our experiment. And we actually conducted 3 experiments. This is just to give you a flavor of what we did. And so Each participant was shown a description of a fictional brand and then a description of the brand's CSR reputation, depending on the group, high or low CSR reputation. They were asked to rate their purchase intentions about these brands, their brand. Then we showed them a fictional CSR announcement about the brand, which may have been Corrective, Compensating, or Cultivating, depending on the group. Again, we asked now, after you've seen this CSR announcement, please rate your purchase intentions of the brand. And then we asked the participants to rate how sincere they view the brand CSR initiative. And what we found, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that Corrective CSR initiatives were seen as the most sincere initiatives. Compensating were also seen as sincere, but not as sincere as Corrective. And then Cultivating were seen, CSR initiatives were seen as relatively insincere. Now I'm going to move on to talk about the impact of CSR reputation, but just keep in mind that we also did the same analysis with the real world data, and we replicated this in a lab. Just for time's sake, I'm going to focus on it for the lab portion here. What we found was that brands that had a lower CSR reputation actually saw a greater boost in sales when they, or purchase intentions for the lab experiments, but in the real world data, we saw a greater boost in sales when they engaged in Corrective and Compensating CSR. And the intuition is that high reputation brands, consumers actually expect them to do the right thing. There's somewhat of a ceiling effect. You've been addressing your harm and now you're doing it a little more. That's great. But for lower reputation brands who have not been addressing their harm and now they have started to do that, consumers react even more positively. On the other hand, for Cultivating CSR, we find the purchase intentions to be lower, and that there is not a statistically significant difference between high and low reputation brands. And just to be clear, in the actual sales data, that's actually a negative impact on sales and not just a lower impact on purchase intentions. So what does this all mean? Well, as I mentioned, we find that actually consumers do not respond positively from every form of CSR. In fact, CSR initiatives where a brand seeks to address its own harm actually relates to a boost in sales, while CSR where initiatives where the actions are focused on philanthropy and simply cultivating goodwill relates to a slight drop in sales. Now, our findings suggest that brands should strive to clean up their own mess before engaging in philanthropy that might be seen as insincere. And as I mentioned, just done to check a box or cultivate the goodwill of the consumers. And managers should, possibly reconsider engaging in CSR actions that cannot be linked to their own harm to society or the environment. And just a few examples. I think it was just in October of 2021, Coca-Cola was rated for the 4th year in a row as a top polluter in the world. And I'm sure some of you may have seen the photos of the bottles all over the beaches and the plastic patch, all of those things. And so it's not surprising that Coca-Cola has announced that they're going to be focusing on 100% can and bottle recycling by 2030. That's not that far away. I wish them luck. But according to our research, it seems that a corrective action geared towards an environmentally focused, they should actually, they may see a sales bump. They should see a sales bump. The Starbucks Race Together campaign that I discussed from 2015 actually received significant backlash where consumers felt that that was not Starbucks' place to talk about these issues in stores. And of course, this is in 2015, prior to the 2018 incidents when the 2 Black gentlemen were arrested for waiting in a Starbucks. With that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Dion. It's very, very interesting what you found. I really like the way that you and your team dissected this problem and put a lot of nice conceptual structure on it in terms of the cultivating and compensating, the three types, also the reputation, and then the various types of CSR that the firm could engage in, because that offers a lot of opportunity to manage things better. So we have an opportunity now for questions. So again, you can use the Q&A tab in Zoom to type in your questions. I'll go ahead and get us started with a few that came to my mind and that I think would be potentially interesting to our listeners. One is, did your team look at whether firms were using multiple announcements of this type within, say, a given year? Was there kind of diminishing returns to making multiple CSR announcements? Did they get equal kind of brand sales effects across those different announcements?
Right, that's actually something that we thought about before. The way that we structure our analysis, whenever a brand, we try to just focus on one CSR announcement in a particular year. Now, we had brands that did multiple CSR, multiple different types of CSR announcements over various years, but in a given year, we focused on brands that just had one new initiative because we wanted to rule out other factors. But that's something that my team and I, we thought about, and maybe something that we might look at in future research, multiple CSR types of CSR initiatives in 1 year.
Thank you. I think, that might be, I think that would be interesting to people who are actually trying to manage these questions. So I see a question came in through a different means. Let's see if I can find it in the chat. If you guys can use the Q&A tab, that would be great. But here's a question from Ashish, and he asks whether CSR strategies company-wide would also affect sales. I don't know if you made a distinction between for the brand or whether they were corporate-wide types of campaigns. Did you guys
Yeah, that's a great question. We focused on brand level, but some brands are synonymous with their larger company name. So we had, for example, in our data set, we had Coca-Cola that had company-wide initiatives, but of course, Coca-Cola is also the brand name. So we looked at it from that perspective. We focused on brands, but in some cases, the brand is the corporate parent's name.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just one other question from me, which is that you shared the intuition that part of the reason that firms didn't get the larger bump from the social types of CSR initiatives was because some of them were what I would call kind of divisive or politically, some people may not be on board with those kinds of ideas. Did you actually have a chance to code the social in terms of whether they were more politically kind of hot or cold in terms of your work?
We actually didn't, but we were able to read a really great JM article from 2020. I believe it's Bhagwat et al. That looked at corporate activism and how sometimes some of these initiatives are seen as corporate activism and can have a negative impact on organizations.
Mm-hmm. I think that's probably part of what's explaining it. If you had some social activities where they weren't as divisive, where they were more universally accepted, you might not see that drop. But there's also a question here from Carol about, I know you can't look at sales to a particular customer, but when you think about some types of brands, maybe they're more focused on youthful target markets. Did you find, or do you expect that you would find that those brands would benefit more from CSR on average than, say, kind of an older person's brand, just because of the, how the generations vary?
Yeah, I think this is a wonderful question. We did not look at the brands in terms of their target markets, but just from my, general research about CSR and readings, and just looking at the trends. The younger generations, Gen Z, they definitely are expecting brands to address environmental and social issues to a greater extent than, let's say the baby boomers or even Gen X. So I would expect for these effects to be even more pronounced for younger consumers.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think that's a kind of a neat moderator too. So one of the questions that I think lurks in your findings is the question of financial resources. Were there, differences in terms of the way in which companies spent on these? If Coca-Cola spends, $1 billion, but small company spends $1 million, did you find any difference there in terms of at least how many financial resources they were pledging to spend, I guess?
Yeah. This is a really great question. What I think that you see is that in the announcement, some companies will actually say how much they're spending, others do not. And so it's a little difficult to make that distinction. But I think that it's telling that they don't always say how much they spend on these initiatives, because that's definitely going to make a difference in the impact. This is one of the reasons why we wanted to do the experiment, because we could control for the amount that was that we told them that was spent on each type of initiative, because in the real world data, that data is just not available. But I believe that it would make a difference, obviously.
Julia has a good question, which is what kinds of procedures or steps did you take to make sure that your results the results recorded on sales were actually related to the CSR initiative and not due to other factors that may have been coinciding with the announcement?
Yes. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we controlled for a number of factors, including the price of the products, the markets, the seasonality, the display and distribution, advertising, press coverage. We also had, some mechanism to control for the number of new corporate social responsibility products, the innovation of the products, the product quality. So we added a number of factors to rule those things out. That's why one of the reasons for your first question, Chris, about multiple CSR campaigns in a particular year, we really wanted to focus on just one so that we could roll out the impact of another initiative on the sales results.
Mac has a question about word of mouth. Did you look at all at the effect? I guess you could look at social media kinds of activity. Did you guys investigate the impact of CSR on word of mouth activity about the company?
Thank you for that question, because that is a project I'm working on right now as we speak with one of my colleagues at Indiana. We're looking at the impact of social media. I'm meeting with them on next week. So please stay tuned. Hopefully I'll be invited back to present those findings. But yes.
Yeah, it sounds like a really cool topic to investigate. Ashish has a question about the long-term impact. You focus really more on that immediate year following the announcement. Do you expect, or did you investigate any of the longer-term effects?
We did look at the longer-term effects and found that the results are essentially the same. Actually, we see about a 1.5 multiplier effect. So whereas Corrective had a 1% in the short term 1 year, but over a longer term couple of years, we see about 1.5% increase, 4.5% for Compensating, and about 5.2 decrease for Cultivating.
Wow, that's interesting. And the Geographical Scope, all of these companies were U.S. companies, right? U.S. CPG companies.
all of the sales data is in the U.S. Obviously, something like Coca-Cola is a multinational organization, and even some of the CSR campaigns were targeted not necessarily in the U.S., but we looked at sales in the U.S. and announcements that were in the U.S.
Right, and I would imagine the expectations might even be higher overseas if you were to use European countries. So just kind of going to your reputation effect, that you might not see a bump as big. So just a couple of, maybe one final question, which is from Jamil about, did you have any really innovative examples that really stood out to you in your work that you could point to as interesting CSR initiatives?
In terms of innovativeness, I wouldn't say necessarily innovativeness. I think that brands that really were focusing on aspects of their supply chain, at least for me, was very interesting, because those are things that consumers may not be as aware of. So there was a seventh generation, not surprisingly, the household cleaners, household products brand looked at removing palm oil from any of their ingredients list. So I think that it wasn't anything in terms of innovation, because it's a consumer packaged goods. And so, there's the plant-based bottle that Heinz has. They got their technology from Coca-Cola. That was kind of interesting that they had shared that technology. But in general, it was whenever they were looking deeper into their supply chain. And I feel like as consumers, we're very far removed and often don't even think about that. So whenever I saw that in the data set, I thought that was really interesting and cool.
Interesting. So, well, thank you so much. Let me just mention a few things. First, if you're interested in reading Dion's paper, in the chat, we put both a link to the managerial summary plus the actual paper. So you can click through and grab the paper and also get that managerial summary, which I think is also really nice for the classroom if you're teaching. We had a couple of other questions about the presentation slides. This video will be posted up on the web within a couple of days. So you'll be able to go back to that Scholarly Insights link and also the webinar link and pull the slides. If you want the actual slides, why don't you write Dion directly and she can share those with you. So let me just go ahead and close and say thank you very much, Dion. Very interesting work, an important topic for our field. So thanks again.
Thank you.